Okay, well, I have 9:05 on my computer, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us this morning. I'm Erin Greenwald. I'm Vice President of Public Programs at the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. Also on the call is Claire Shelburne, who's part of our grants team at the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities, and Jolie Johnson, who is representing the Louisiana Association of Museums, our co-partner in hosting this workshop series. We are really excited to be able to bring this workshop series to folks across Louisiana from various cultural organizations. The intent here is for us to initiate a conversation. And really, it's an ongoing conversation that's already taking place, right, in a lot of corners, whether you are part of Louisiana Association of Museums or Louisiana Archives and Manuscripts Association or Southeastern Museums Conference or any of these other American Library Association kind of umbrella groups. If you live in Louisiana, you're probably tied to an organization that is talking about disaster preparedness as we see more and more severe weather in South Louisiana and really across the country. The LEH's mission is to partner with communities, institutions, and individuals to explore Louisiana's past, reflect on our present, and imagine our future. And the only way that we can do those things is in partnership with the rich cultural organizations across the state of Louisiana. And the only way they can do those things is if they can sustain themselves in the wake of the myriad disasters that we have experienced, particularly in the last 5 years. We are not alone in experiencing disasters in South Louisiana. These are happening all over the state, whether it is flooding or hurricanes or tornadoes or chemical spills. We are dealing with increased storm frequency and intensity. And we are here to kind of start this conversation about how do I get a plan? How do I make sure that plan stays active and doesn't sit on a shelf? So the LEH has, for the last few years, been in a position where we have been able to advocate for additional funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which is also sponsoring today's workshop, for funding in response to various disasters. When parishes are declared a federal disaster area, we are able to request emergency funds from the NEH. We don't always get them. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. But in hearing your voices, we survey you. Generally, you've probably received emails from me asking you to weigh in on the kinds of damage you've experienced. We are able to provide small emergency disaster mitigation grants after the fact. What we're trying to do through these workshops is get everyone thinking about what we can do as cultural organizations to be proactive, to make sure we have a plan and that plan really fits the size of your organization. Because we work with organizations that are 150 people, that are incredibly well-resourced. We work with small archives and museums that have staffs of 2 people. And we understand that disaster plans have to be aligned to what your staff capacity and your resources are. We're so excited to be here this morning, and we hope that you really get something out of this. I'm going to turn it over to Jolie in just a second, but I wanted to mention part of the reason we're doing these workshops is to better understand what our communities need. Do you need disaster supply funding? Do you need funding to hire a consultant to help you create a disaster plan? If you were able to get funding to do some mitigation to your building, would that help you be better prepared? So you'll be getting a survey. Claire will put it in the chat, but you'll also get it as a follow-up to this conversation, asking you to weigh in. And the more information we have, the better we are able to advocate not only to the National Endowment for the Humanities, but also to our partners at the state for making sure that our cultural communities are taken care of. So you'll see that survey. Please fill it out. I'm going to turn over the speaking baton to Jolie Johnson. She's going to go through some housekeeping notes, review the agenda, and then we'll get started. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin. Excuse me. All right, I'm going to speak now today. We ask that everyone remain on mute throughout the presentation to eliminate any reverb or background noise that you may have going on at your offices. If you have a question as we go through our 3 presentations, please enter it into the chat box. We will be monitoring that for questions. Each presenter will speak for approximately 15 minutes about their work and the resources they have available for you. And then after they have presented, our moderator, Erin Greenwald, will facilitate a question and answer portion so we can get into more depth conversation about some items there. We will also take all of the resources that are going to be shared with you today, and they will be compiled into a PDF and sent. So you don't have to worry about taking copious notes to make sure you catch everything. We will be sending around kind of a resource kit to disaster planning. If you would also like to use closed captioning today, if you look and highlight the bottom of your toolbar on your Zoom, you'll see the CC closed captioning option. So please click that if you'd like it available for you. And this session will be recorded for the purpose of continuing education and providing resources for those who could not attend today's workshop. So I'm now going to briefly introduce myself and how I got involved. My name is Jolie Johnson. I live in Lafayette, Louisiana. I've been working in the museum field for approximately 10 years here in Lafayette. I have a general focus on program development, operations, educations, things like that. And I now write grants and help develop or analyze strategic plans. And I also get to work with wonderful people and organize these professional development workshops and speaker series, which has been really fun because I really believe in the power of providing accessible continuing education, even once you're in your career. And the other thing we are going to share is wanted to share my first disaster that I could remember. I was 6 years old when Hurricane Andrew hit Louisiana. My hometown is in Matthews, Louisiana, which is Lafourche Parish, which just also got hit. But I vividly remember being in the hallway with probably about 10 other people who came to my house for shelter. And hearing that storm pass through. And I will never forget that once I realized that's what the true impact of the storms and where we live and how serious it could be. And I'm also joined today by my assistant, Maxwell. So I apologize for any interruptions he may provide, but he's very excited to learn about disaster preparedness as well.
Thanks, Jolie. Before I introduce the speakers, I'd love to encourage all of you who are on the call to please identify yourselves in the chat by your name and your institution. We'd love to hear where you're coming from. Yeah, Caroline says it's never too young to start, and I agree. My earliest storm memory is from when I was probably around 6 years old in Pensacola, Florida, and I have no idea what hurricane it was, but I remember we drove across town to my grandmother's house because she lived on a hill, and that's really all I remember. But I'm going to introduce our speakers in the order in which they will be speaking today. And guys, after I introduce you, if we could pause and you tell us maybe your first experience of dealing with a disaster professionally, like a quick anecdote about your first disaster response experience. So our first speaker today is Susan Zwerling. She's the Core Document Verification Officer at the American Alliance of Museums. Susan works with museums and peer reviewers participating in AAM's Museum Assessment Program to help strengthen operations, plan for the future, and meet professional standards. She began her museum career in the education department of an art and science museum and has extensive experience in staff training and development. She holds a master's in museum studies from Johns Hopkins University. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you, Erin, and thanks to LEH and everybody that's working behind the scenes and now in front of the camera to make this happen. I'm glad to join in. I think the first disaster that that I experienced remains one of my most bizarre. Working in a museum in South Texas, and a freak storm came through and dumped a whole bunch of not just water and rain and wind, but also a lot of hail. And we were without power for 3 days, and we had about 3 inches of water in all of our galleries of our museum that we were using squeegees and brooms and everything else we could find to try to get it out of there. But in our inner courtyard, our sculpture garden had about 4 inches of hail that got dropped. So we also were out there with shovels, hand shoveling hail. And that was quite an experience, but I'm really proud to say we did not have damage to a single item in our collection, which was pretty cool.
Thanks, Susan. Our second speaker is Elena Gregg, who is the Emergency Programs Coordinator for the Foundation for Advancement in Conservation. Elena previously served as Collections Care Specialist for Vizcaya Museum and Gardens in Miami, Florida, and as Institutional Liaison to Miami-Dade County's Office of Emergency Management. She holds a Master's in Disaster Management from Florida International University. Welcome, Elena.
Hi, everybody, and likewise, thank you so much for having us today, and I'm super excited to speak on this topic. My first professional disaster experience was with Hurricane Irma in 2017. It went through South Florida, and several institutions received varying levels of damage, but the institution I was at sustained a great deal of damage. The eastern side of the property was pummeled. There's a historic stone barge out in Biscayne Bay, and a lot of stone elements on the eastern terrace that were just really significantly damaged. And even 5 years later, the institution is still very much in the recovery phase of the storm. So was a big eye-opener. I'm originally from Northeast Ohio, so I have a lot of experience with snow, but I had not had as much experience with hurricanes, and that definitely very much impacted my both personal and professional life.
Thanks, Elena. And our final speaker today, many of you probably know, is Lee Loomis, who is with EGL Consultants. Lee's a certified archivist and records manager with more than 25 years of experience in archives and records management. She holds leadership positions in national and international archives organizations, including the International Council on Archives, where she chairs the expert group on emergency management and disaster preparedness. She's participated in major recovery efforts after local and regional disasters, especially those related to hurricanes and flooding in South Louisiana. Welcome.
Thank you. So my first professional experience at the helm for a disaster was Hurricane Katrina, which all of us in South Louisiana and Mississippi are very familiar with the damage that it took. So not only was I working with just the institution, the Archdiocese of New Orleans was in charge of, or has under its umbrella, 110, maybe back then 120 churches, 65 schools, nursing homes, etc. So it wasn't just one facility, it was facilities throughout many different parishes in South Louisiana. So that recovery effort took more than 18 months. And still, of course, there was more to do even after those 18 months when we were able to get fully back into facilities. I will revert back to, I'm a little older than some of the others when they were talking about Hurricane Andrew. I go back to running across the street during Hurricane Betsy to the two-story house when I was probably 6 or 7 years old. My father is a meteorologist, so I grew up with the knowledge of hurricanes, and going from being a small kid and dealing with it to being a professional and dealing with it. That experience is helpful, but it is nothing like having to coordinate a disaster in a facility.
Thank you so much, Lee. And just Jolie mentioned it, but if you have questions at any point during today's program, please put them in the chat. We've reserved plenty of time at the end of the program to go through some specific or general questions that you might have. And as a reminder, this is the first of a two-part series. This particular workshop will focus on readiness and planning. And then the next workshop featuring Lori Foley from FEMA, who is also on the call today, will deal with response and recovery. And we've also got folks coming on from the National Heritage responders, and we'll have a case study of a rapid response initiative that took place at the Hilliard Museum in Lafayette a few years ago. So thank you so much. And I'm going to turn this over to Susan Zwerling, our first speaker.
Well, good morning again, y'all. I'm excited to share with you some resources that we offer at the Alliance America. If I can talk today, I can share some resources. The American Alliance of Museums, AAM, and also some tips and tricks that I've learned over the years reviewing documents for museums. AAM has actually identified 5 different core documents that collectively all fit together to help you build a house of bricks rather than a house of cards for your museum or your cultural institution. And these 5 documents are your mission statement, a collections management plan, a code of ethics, a strategic plan, and then a disaster plan. So institutions we've worked with tell us that going through all of those necessary conversations, making some of those tough decisions in advance, crafting the policies and the procedures together as a team, and making clear, specific plans in these 5 key areas takes a lot of time, but it's well worth it. It's a type of risk management, and it helps everybody, the board, the staff, the volunteers, all sleep more soundly at night when you have those 5 documents in place and everybody knows what to do. The disaster plan, of course, is especially crucial one because a disaster can bring down a house of cards in a matter of minutes. And the 2-year COVID pandemic has really caused many of us to learn some hard lessons, right? A well thought out disaster plan keeps you organized and ensures that you have supplies. It assigns roles to everyone so that you don't have 12 people stacking up the sandbags, 8 people boarding up the windows, and nobody moving those top priority collection items upstairs or off-site. This kind of disaster plan also lays out ahead of time who makes certain decisions. Who, for instance, can make or authorize those needed emergency purchases? Who's going to talk to the public or to the media or to the insurance company about the incident? Who comes in to care for the living collection if the institution is closed for more than a day or 2? You don't want to make these kinds of important decisions when you're under pressure. You want to make them ahead of time when everybody is calm, cool, and collected. Having a plan already in place means you can hit the ground running when something does happen and not waste precious time with debates and conversations. A well-crafted disaster plan also reassures your community, your donors, your funders, and yes, your insurance company, that you really have done everything possible to prepare for calamities, and you will safeguard their investments into your institution, their objects, their money, their time, their love. So AAM uses 4 categories of threats that you'll need to be ready to address. And I'm going to screen share here for those of us that are visual learners. And scoot us over here a little bit. So we basically have 4 different kinds of threats, 4 different categories to help you organize what you need to assess and what you need to be ready for. So the first category is natural, and we have some examples there. Tornado, floods, earthquakes, hurricanes are all examples of natural disasters. The second category is a mechanical threat. And that could be something like a power failure, an explosion, a chemical spill, or a gas leak. A biological type of threat might be insects, rodents and animals, disease, or poison. And then a human threat could be terrorism, a bomb threat, vandalism, or theft. So each museum is unique, of course, and the type of facility that you're in, the type of collections that you have, and the location you're at all play a big role. As I learned growing up in Houston, for example, oil refinery events like spills, leaks, burn-offs, explosions, they're a unique kind of threat, along with the more obvious hurricane threats that we face on the Gulf Coast. When I lived in New Orleans, I also learned how to prepare for spring termite swarms. That was a new one for me. So a disaster plan needs to be customized. They are not one size fits all. AAM also uses 4 stages of risk management. And it's not going to progress, is it? All right. For a while there, I was being elegant. I'm going to go out of that and I'm going to go back in and see if I can get it unstuck for us. All right, can y'all see that? Okay, thanks. So the 4 stages of risk management would be, the first one is mitigation, which is how do you prevent disasters and emergencies? The second one is how do you prepare for it? The third stage is what kind of response are you going to have to it? And then the 4th stage is how are you going to recover from it? So those 4 different stages are different for different kinds of emergencies, but some of them overlap. For example, the samples that you see here on the screen, you'll see that facility assessments pops up as an example in 3 out of 4 of these stages, because a facility assessment is something that you're going to want to do as you're figuring out how to prevent things, as you're responding, and then as you're recovering. So they don't exist in a vacuum. There is some overlap to them. And we offer at AAM a fee-based program that is called core document verifications. And museums submit to us those 5 core documents that I mentioned earlier to get reviewed by somebody like me and get them verified. And this is something that museums do as a prerequisite when they want to prepare to becoming accredited by AAM, but it's also a standalone program. And many of the museums that I work with and cultural institutions will go through core document verifications as a part of their risk management and being able to sleep better at night, even though they may never have an institutional goal of getting accredited later on. So it's something that you can do in either scenario. So how do we go about verifying a core document? Well, what we do is we look for the required elements. And this particular plan that we're talking about, the disaster plan, has 8 required elements that I look for when I'm verifying a document. So that includes preparedness and response plans for all relevant emergencies and threats. So again, those 4 different types that I just talked about, those 4 categories. I look to make sure that a plan addresses the needs of staff, visitors, structures, and the collection. I look to make sure that it specifies how to protect, evacuate, and recover your collections in the event of a disaster. I look to make sure that it includes evacuation routes and assembly areas for people after they've left the facility. I look to make sure that it's assigning responsibilities to specific people, either by name or title, to take action during the emergency itself. Want to make sure there's contact information for relevant emergency and recovery services. If you've discovered that your textiles are wet and you know they're growing mold as you speak, you don't want to have to dig and hunt for the phone number of a conservator. You want to get that textiles person in as quickly as possible. It needs to include floor plans. And those floor plans need to be pretty specific. We look to make sure that you're showing evacuation routes and exit areas. We look to make sure that you're showing the location of equipment such as your fire extinguishers, your first aid kit, and your flashlights. A lot of people think they can rely on a cell phone for and the flashlight app. And I'm here to tell you, as somebody who's been without power for many, many days, that's not going to work. You want to save that cell phone and its battery for precious communications. You don't want to use that battery for a flashlight. So old school flashlights have a very important role to play, and we want to make sure you've got those. And then we need to make sure that you've got the last date that you had it revised. If you did this in 2015, it's probably not going to serve you that well now. I'm going to stop screen sharing for a minute here. And it is not letting me. I wonder if, there we go. We've got a lot of rain and wind, and I have a feeling that my internet connection is not that great. So apologies for the awkwardness, but I'm still here and you're still here. And I want to reassure you that there is no need to reinvent the wheel. Absolutely not. Okay, we all are dealing with this. That's why we're here talking together. It's a common shared concern that we want to share tips and tricks and ways to be able to help each other go through disasters successfully. And there are a lot of resources that are out there to help you craft your disaster plan. Our website has the required elements for each of those 5 core documents on it, along with guidelines and some activities to help you talk through some of these decisions. And as was mentioned earlier, you're going to get a packet later on with all of these links and all of this resource information for you. We also have at AAM a sample documents library. It's a member benefit to the museums that have the tier 3 level membership, and it can save a whole lot of time and work because this sample library has samples of downloadable core documents from other museums that have already been verified by us. So you know they meet the required elements. And as Jolie Johnson was telling me a few weeks ago, her museum found that the library's searching filters are really helpful. She was able to just look at disaster plans, for example, for academic art museums in a certain size budget and put in some of those parameters to be sure that she was looking at plans that were going to be a close fit for her institution's needs. So I'm going to hand the virtual mic over to Jolie for a minute so that she can share a little more about that experience with y'all.
So one thing I realized was when I started working with Susan, I was named our project manager at the Hilliard Art Museum as we were going through core document verification process. So been working with Susan on these documents we worked on them for a very long time. I didn't realize that we were a tier 3 member, or maybe I was told that like at orientation or at other points working there, but I never realized or really looked at the resources that came with that. So I wanted to mention, like, make sure you're checking with your office manager, whoever handles memberships, and those resources that are there for you and your coworkers. You may have access to it already, and you may not know, because it's pretty wonderful. And we used it throughout the core document verification process for all of our documents. And then later we went through the museum assessment program through the IMLS and AAM partnership. And then we began looking at education and interpretation plans that then our curator and educator now have found a plan through the library that they are using kind of as a guiding point, that they really liked how, I think it was the Clark Museum of Art, was moving through its university art museum, and we liked how they approached and they worked with their student body. So it's a resource that you take with you outside of this process. So I just wanted to share my personal experience using that library, and don't forget to always check back with your office manager, whoever it is, find out what those resources that you may already have available to you right now.
Oh, that's a great experience and a great tip to share, because yeah, if it's already been purchased and paid for, you might as well use it in any way you can. And as Jolie said, the library has lots of other kinds of samples besides those 5 core documents. There's loan forms, interpretation plans, memorandums of understanding, employee handbooks, samples of volunteer policies, and just all kinds of other documents that help with overall institutional operations. So yeah, don't reinvent that wheel. It's been done so many times already. Now, we've also worked with museums that have used a free template. It's called D-Plan, and it was funded a while back by IMLS and a couple of other entities. And there's now, I think, a version 2. And that will can be very successful in helping you create the collections portion of your disasters plan. And we'll include a link for that in the packet that you'll get later as well. It's a good tool. It's got an outline. It gets prompts that walk you through completing that portion of your plan. And that's completely free. What I'd like to do now is to walk you through a disaster plan from a museum that I happen to be reviewing right now for possible verification, and to show you how they used our framework to create their plan, and also a couple of cool innovations that I noticed as I was working my way through their plan. So if the internet is working, I'm going to screen share again. There we go. So what you should see now is a framework of a plan. So basically, this is putting together the things that I talked about before. So your plan, first of all, it's helpful to list the type of potential threat or risk or disaster with those 4 categories. So you can sit down and just list these 4 categories and then brainstorm everything you can possibly think of within these 4 categories that could be a potential risk or threat to your institution. And then within each one of those 4 categories, you can decide and describe how to mitigate, how to prepare for, how to respond to, and how to recover from each one of them. And then for each one, you want to be certain that you remember to address people, collections, and facilities. And that is basically what this museum did. So I'm looking at their table of contents. They basically did a chapter for different kinds of identified risks. So separated parties and missing children, medical emergency and injuries. So those would be in that human category. Fire, explosion, tornado, severe weather, earthquake, flood, those all fit in that natural category. Mechanical, they had utilities interruptions like gas, water, or electric. They had also, excuse me, they also had floods, and they had gas leak and hazardous spills. And then more human risks: bomb threat, a suspicious package, a bomb threat call-in, a threatening person, a public disturbance going on, or an active shooter. And then some of their biological threats that they identified were pandemic preparedness and pests. And then after they did those sections, they went through them and they identified, as I said before, how they were going to respond to those, to mitigate, to prepare for, to respond to, and to recover from. Then they did it within those categories of people and collections, and then your facility. So they were pretty organized about it, and it was a pleasure to read it. Then they also had some of the other things that we look for, much more detailed information regarding the collections and salvage information, that kind of thing. That's always a thick part of a good, juicy disaster plan. And then emergency contact information, supplies, floor plans, and evacuation routes and gathering spots, like I mentioned before. So that was a really smart way for them to deal with it. One of the innovations that I noticed that kind of made my heart go pitter patter was at the beginning of each one of these little chapters or categories, they had 5 pieces of information that they always had right at the top at a bullet point to make it super easy for someone to find quickly. So they listed who the point person was for that kind of disaster. They listed who was expected to respond. They listed how to report it if you're the person that discovers it. They listed whether or not to evacuate. And they listed where the checkpoint or the gathering point was supposed to be if there was going to be an evacuation, or even internally a place to go or gather. And I thought that was a thing of beauty. Some institutions might also want to add a sixth bullet point up at the very top of supplies that were needed for that particular kind of threat or kind of risk. So that's something that, that it could kind of popped into my head. So for separated parties and missing children, for example, the point person was the manager on duty and security. Who responds? It's the guest experience team and the security team. How to report it? You dial this extension or you use the radio. Do you need to evacuate? No. What's the checkpoint or the gathering point? You go to the welcome desk or to the manager on duty, whoever is closest to the location you happen to be at. Another approach that made this a pleasure to read and made me want to work in this institution was that they were very, very specific with some benchmarks. For example, this issue of separated parties and missing children, they said very specifically, if a missing child is not found within 5 minutes of searching the building, call the police. So as a staff person or a volunteer, I know exactly what I'm supposed to do first, for how long I'm supposed to do it, and if that doesn't work, what I'm supposed to do next. That is extremely helpful and very reassuring to anybody that's dealing with an emergency, especially for the first time. And this institution happens to have 3 floors. It's not very big, but it's got 3 floors. And that can make communication and organization tricky. So they dealt with that by assigning a floor captain. Floor 1, floor 2, and floor 3. They each have a captain. And they gave each floor captain a bag. That disaster bag has a safety vest, a flashlight, a first aid kit, a clipboard with a pen, a hard hat, and a whistle. Not bad. And people want to help, but they don't always know what to do or when to do it. So any kind of specific instructions like do this first, do this 5 minutes later, look for the floor captain with the safety vest and the hard hat, or move the collection items with that red sticker first before you move anything else, are reassuring to people. And it just makes it much more likely that your institution's top priority concerns are going to get successfully addressed. Now, if you already have a disaster plan in place, it's important to revisit it and update it every year or so. That phone number for that textiles conservator might have changed. A new threat might now exist like COVID that didn't exist a few years ago. Museums located near fracking operations in states like Ohio, for example, they now have to figure out earthquake threats. That wasn't even an issue in their community 5 or 10 years ago. So our world is changing more rapidly. It's becoming more complex. And a solid disaster plan lays out a foundation for those pivots and those nimble adjustments that are now pretty much of our new normal. All of these nitty-gritty specific procedures are super important. But there's one more thing that a stellar disaster plan has in it: your core values. Really important. And this institution that I'm reviewing right now clearly has had some intense conversations about some sticky situations. And the decisions they've made, they tell me something about who they are. The section on separated parties and missing children, for instance, they've really done some talking. For example, they're distinguishing not between just missing children, but they're also taking into account adults who might have a dementia or some kind of impairment that may have caused them to be separated from the group that they're with. And they have some details in there that tell me, as I said, who they are. For example, get down to the eye level of this person in a non-threatening manner and introduce yourself. Never try to pick up a child. You may offer 1 or 2 fingers for them to hold on to as you escort them to the welcome desk. And I'm not endorsing this. You may decide that the best thing to do for a child is to give them a big hug. Every institution is different. Every institution deals with that differently. It just told me that they'd had these conversations and they made some decisions together that are important. If the person that you find is nonverbal, be reassuring. Stay as close to them as possible until security arrives to take over for you. So they've done those kinds of conversations. And the more time you take to have those conversations together that include some heart and soul, the more ownership everybody's going to feel about the disaster plan that you ultimately come up with together. And the more alignment that you have between your core values and your policies and programs and procedures in general, the more they're going to accurately reflect who you really are and who you want to be for your community and your employees and your volunteers. And that can be some of the best glue of all for building a house of brick together. So I'm really delighted that I could join in with you today and share some of our resources and programs to help guide and support your institution's disaster readiness. And I'll look forward to answering any of your questions later on in the workshop. And you'll get that email later on with the links to the resources that I mentioned too. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Susan. Communication, I think you're going to hear over and over again. Communication before a disaster with all of your staff members so that everyone understands what their role is in a disaster will really help make sure that you bring a certain level of calm, but also to keep you productive and efficient so you're not duplicating work and leaving work undone. Elena.
Yes, hello. Thank you again for having me. As Erin said, I'm Elena Gregg, the Emergency Programs Coordinator for the Foundation for Advancement in Conservation. And today I'm going to speak about a few disaster resources available to you through FAIC. And I'll focus primarily on our Alliance for Response initiative. So first, just a brief introduction to our organization. The Foundation for Advancement in Conservation is the foundation side of the American Institute for Conservation, or AIC. And AIC is the national membership organization for conservation professionals in the United States. On the foundation side, we support conservation through education, research, and outreach. And we administer a whole bunch of programs, including the Collections Assessment for Preservation, or CAP program, which provides small and mid-sized museums with partial funding toward a general conservation assessment. We're also home to Connecting to Collections Care, which provides resources, professional development opportunities, and support for caring for collections. C2C Care is also aimed at small to mid-sized museums. And then in line with today's topic, I oversee FAIC's emergency programs, which includes the National Heritage Responders, Alliance for Response, and Mayday, among others. So what is Alliance for Response, or I'll abbreviate it as AFR? AFR is an effort to bring together both cultural heritage and emergency management personnel on the local level. It's very intentionally a local effort. And there are over 30 networks set up nationwide. We have networks from Seattle, Washington, to Oklahoma City, to Vermont, so all over the US. And the motivation behind this effort was to really bridge the gap between cultural heritage and emergency management. So as we all know, when disasters occur, it's the local community that's going to respond first. It can take a long time, sometimes days, weeks, or longer for the state and federal level resources to arrive. So it's really important that the local community is ready right away, as everyone here knows. And one of the keys to preparedness is a relationship with first responders and emergency managers. They're the first on the scene at any event that's going to risk life or safety. And I think often the emergency management sector has sometimes overlooked a community's cultural and historic assets. So AFR is really an identification and acknowledgement that this gap existed and an effort to kind of bring it together. It was started in 2003, and it remains effective by encouraging institutions to complete disaster plans and train for emergencies, by raising awareness of the importance of cultural heritage in communities, and by influencing official emergency policies and plans. So on the FAIC side, we support AFR in a variety of ways. We provide around 2 free webinars each year on topics ranging from health and safety considerations following disasters, to the psychology of disasters, to establishing and maintaining emergency supply caches. So how to identify what supplies your region's going to need, where to store them, and just other considerations you should have for supply management. We also recently began offering microgrants of up to $2,500 to AFR networks. I think in the past, there's been a challenge to find funding for network activities and to just keep networks engaged. So this is really an effort to have something for networks to either provide, some type of network-wide training, or to get supplies, or to provide or make instructional materials for their network members. And then in 2021, we created an Alliance for Response Advisory Committee, and that includes the chairs of 10 AFR networks nationwide. It's very intentionally a wide scope of people. We want representation of a whole bunch of different hazards and disaster types around the country. And we've found since the start of AFR that even though different networks are dealing with very different disaster types, the struggles and challenges surrounding the networks are pretty consistent. So communication, finding funds, keeping members engaged. So by creating this advisory committee, we pick one topic every 3 months and are able to just discuss it and see if there's ways that either we on the FAIC side or that they can help each other, or if one network has figured something out, they can share it with the rest. And so it's really just an effort to provide a mechanism for connectedness amongst the very many networks nationwide. And finally, we provide regional response trainings to 1 to 2 networks each year, which is funding permitting, but more on this later. And much of what we are able to provide for AFR is supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities. So just want to give them a brief shout out. So before we proceed, I'll share a personal example. So before coming to FAIC in 2020, I worked in the conservation section for Vizcaya Museum and Gardens, as I mentioned before. And the museum is located less than 100 feet from Biscayne Bay, and has exposure to every type of agent of deterioration. So Vizcaya sustained a significant amount of damage from Hurricane Irma, as I was talking about at the beginning of the workshop. And we had a flooded basement, water intrusion into decorated spaces, damaged exteriors, damaged stone elements, debris throughout the property. I think there were also like 100 mismatched flip-flops in the gardens, like just bizarre things ended up all over the property. But thankfully, Vizcaya was part of South Florida Alliance for Response, and we benefited from having members of the AFR join us in our response efforts. So typically the goal is if one institution is damaged more severely than another, then members from the institution that was less damaged can help out. And that definitely played out in this response. But one of the chairs of South Florida AFR actually works in the Miami-Dade Office of Emergency Management, or OEM. And after Hurricane Irma, and after recognizing that there definitely could be more support from the county level for cultural assets and institutions, Miami-Dade's OEM established a seat in the Emergency Operations Center, or EOC, that was dedicated to Alliance for Response. So they put the seat under the Emergency Support Function 18, which was the ESF representing business and industry for the county. And for every subsequent event, which ranged from tropical storms, hurricanes, to even the Super Bowl, someone from AFR could be there and could kind of serve as that connector between county resources to the cultural sector. So all of this to say, these relationships definitely take time to establish. I think it was probably 5 years of really frequent communication and intentionality behind making that connection with the county emergency management office. But if the time is taken and, if the effort is there, it really can benefit a region highly. So the state of Louisiana, there is currently one Alliance for Response network in Louisiana. It's located in New Orleans, and they are called the New Orleans Preservation Coalition, and they cover the greater New Orleans area. So NOPC was started in 2018. It's chaired by Jennifer Waxman and Aaron Alberton. And since establishing NOPC, the network has held regular member meetings. They've coordinated a response to Hurricane Ida for local archives and museums. They've organized a panel presentation on post-Katrina recovery of Southern's African art collection. And they've organized a presentation by Nola Reddy about continuity of operations planning. They're also working with us at FAIC to hold a regional response training in New Orleans in 2024. So after I'm done speaking, I'm going to put NOPC's email into the chat in case anybody is interested in joining their network or just wants to hear more about their process. But for those of you who are not located in New Orleans and are in another part of Louisiana and interested in kind of creating this type of network for your region, part of my job is to identify regions around the US that have folks interested in establishing an AFR and then helping you all get started. So included in the list of resources that will be distributed to you all is a link to the Alliance for Response Toolkit and a copy of the AFR planning guide. I'm going to share my screen quickly just to show you what this looks like. Let's see here. Okay. I think you can see my screen now. Okay, so here's FAIC's website, culturalheritage.org. If you scroll over to resources and then down to emergencies, all of our emergency resources are going to populate. And then on the left-hand side, if you go down to Alliance for Response, let's see. Under starting a network, the Alliance for Response Toolkit is there. And there's a list of resources here that can kind of help people get started. So these were all developed after networks had gone through the process of getting their region together. So it's really just an effort to not have you all reinvent the wheel. A lot of questions that have come up and hurdles that networks have gone through are the answers to them are outlined in this toolkit. And then there's a PDF to the forum planning guide that will be included in the list of resources later. But before I proceed, there's also on the left-hand side, there's a bunch of different emergency related resources that are free and open to anybody to peruse. So please check them out if you are interested. Let's see here. Okay. So the forum planning guide provides step-by-step instructions for hosting a kickoff forum for your region. Kickoff forums are typically one-day events where people that will likely form your network will get together. Typically, they'll hear from local experts in the area, and there will be a lot of time for networking. So the goal is really just to bring people together, have an opportunity for people to connect with one another, and then that kind of serves as the launching point for the network. Network priorities are typically discussed amongst the steering committee, who's the group of people that typically works to start the network from its initial form. And yeah, it's really just an opportunity to get people in the same room, and has been very beneficial in the past. And then, so for the regional response trainings, that's one of our outreach programs that I mentioned earlier. The trainings are intended to both reignite Alliance for Response networks and provide foundational collections emergency response knowledge to network members. Trainings consist of an online curriculum that takes about 3 months to complete. And the online curriculum includes very medium specific salvage recommendations. So how to address submerged furniture or paintings, textiles, paper, how to work with disaster recovery companies, health and safety considerations, and a whole bunch of different topics. And then the trainings will culminate in an in-person component that is 2 days long. And the in-person part includes lectures, a mock disaster scenario where participants are broken into smaller groups, assigned different roles, and have to kind of walk through how they would address different hazards affecting their collections. There might be a wet salvage hands-on component. We sometimes have had tabletop exercises incorporated. So it really is up to the region what they think will most benefit their members. But we have a group of instructors that are trained through FAIC, and each training has 2 instructors, and they kind of tailor the instruction to the region that they're instructing. Finally, I'd like to mention May Day, since we're right on the heels of May. And May Day is an effort to encourage cultural institutions to complete one activity each May to enhance their institutional disaster preparedness. So activities could include updating your emergency plan or your emergency kits, providing staff training, maybe going through the initial steps of creating a plan in the first place, restocking emergency supplies, attending an emergency related webinar with a group of your colleagues. So anything that's just going to kind of wrap your mind around what is coming over the next few months. And we at FAIC will host 2 free webinars in the month of May that are focused on disaster themes. So at the beginning of May this year, we're going to highlight tools for disaster planning. We'll talk about Disaster Plan 2.0, which Susan mentioned earlier. We'll also walk through the Emergency Committee, which is a committee within AIC. They have a wiki that has a very comprehensive list of emergency resources. So we'll also walk through that. And then at the end of May, we're going to highlight sustainability as disaster preparedness. So we'll have several experts discussing different ways that you can implement sustainable practices into your institutions. So if you do an activity and want to participate in May Day, we have a survey that will be available all month. It's just a few questions, and by filling it out, you'll be entered into a prize drawing where you can receive a variety of emergency resources through FAIC. So all of that will be shared on our social media accounts over the next few weeks. If you follow AIC, FAIC, we'll announce the webinars and provide links to the survey and all of that fun stuff. Okay, I think that I'm wrapped up.
Thanks, Elena. And we'll be sure in the resource packet that we send out following the workshop to include links to FAIC and AIC, because I think we recognize at the LEH, we work with institutions large and small. And for some of you, having a disaster plan is old hat. You've got one, you revisit it, you enact it probably more than you would like. And for others, you're wondering how to really go about creating one. And it can seem like a monumental task, but we cannot stress enough that existing disaster plan templates can form the basis of any new disaster plan, and you can make adjustments based on your needs, your staff, your reality, your resources. Not everyone's disaster plan is going to be as comprehensive as the next. But we do wonder, before we go on to Lee Loomis's presentation, we're going to do a quick poll. Claire's getting one ready now. And polls are anonymous, so no shame, no glory. Claire, if you will put up the poll, we'd like you to take just a minute to answer these 2 questions.
Can you see it?
Yep, we see it.
Good.
Let's take a minute and answer those questions. How are we looking, Claire?
Pretty good. I'll give everyone just another
minute.
second to get some more responses in there.
Totally anonymous.
Okay, I think
Great.
I will end poll.
All right. And here are our results. Great. All right. 3/4 of you have an existing disaster plan. and the rest of you are on this call. So that is step one. The next question is, how often does your organization revisit its disaster plan? So for some of you, it's pretty regularly. Others, it's annually. As needed is also an interesting category, because often what as needed means is you've just had a disaster and you're like, oh, right, we need to work on that. Or you've narrowly missed a disaster and you've pulled it out and you've realized this is not great. 13% of you don't ever update your disaster plans. You're not sure where it is. It's sitting on a shelf somewhere. And about 40% of you are unsure. Okay, so I think one of the things we can all do after this call is, if you're not sure if you have a disaster plan, find out. And if you don't have a disaster plan, Lee is going to talk us through some manageable, bite-sized things that you can do to get started, because we know that it can seem overwhelming. Even if you have a disaster plan, looking at it can seem overwhelming, but it's going to be okay. All right, Lee.
All right, here we go. So yeah, it is overwhelming. And first of all, thank you, Erin, and to the LEH for having this. Following Elena and Susan is in lots of ways easy, because they've given the big picture, and I get to go a little more granular down into what we have in Louisiana and Southern Mississippi. There are so many people that I'm recognizing names and faces. So many people I already know and I've worked with throughout the years. As I mentioned in the very beginning about Katrina being my first professional disaster and Hurricane Betsy being my first personal disaster, one of the things that I shared earlier was about Betsy. Hurricane Betsy, I ran across the street to a 2-story building. And that used to be what you did in New Orleans. You know, the people in low-lying areas in Chalmette and in Plaquemines Parish and in St. Bernard would evacuate to the city and would evacuate to a hotel, a high-rise hotel, and that's where they rode out the storm. We've seen climate change, and we've seen the Gulf, that the water is intruding. And when you used to, you know, as a kid, I used to go fishing with my parents down in the Chalmette area, actually down into the Gulf. And now when you come up through Chalmette, there's some back end that when you're over 6'10", the water is right there. And the water was never there. I mean, you know, you had a long ways to come up, and you had some barriers before the water came in to the city. We saw all of that change with Katrina. We had a tornado a couple of weeks ago in Arabi. That size tornado we just don't have here in the city. So things are changing, and they're changing more so in how we plan and what we do. Back to Betsy, after Hurricane Betsy, with no electricity for 2 weeks in Metairie, the men in my area, the dads, all got together, put all the barbecue pits in the street, and barbecued off whatever was going bad in some, or was going to be bad the next day in somebody's refrigerator or the freezer, that the dry ice, and they kept just making, you know, they kept collecting what was going to last another day and put it in another one and consolidate the dry ice. We are in a very different area. And after Hurricane Katrina, the lessons that we learned and the lessons that we taught FEMA, and I'm going to say it that way because we all know that they were here, but they weren't here providing what we needed. And I will always remember one of our representatives saying, we need buses and gas, you know, to be able to get out of the city. So I think that now the way we do contraflow, the way we can get out, things are a bit better. So since Katrina, and Katrina taught us also that we needed to have direct deposit. You couldn't have a computer or a server, the little small ones you used to sit next to an accounting desk, to be able to print checks. The Archdiocese of New Orleans was trying to get 500 people paid, so we had to actually come into the city with armed guard to get the server out so that people could get paid. We don't do that anymore. Everybody is electronic check because I certainly want to get paid because usually I'm on the boots on the ground working during a disaster. Fast forward a few years, the Baton Rouge floods that happened because of the torrential rain that happened there. I was able to go up to help and to grab supplies. So oftentimes we don't think about the supplies we even have in our house or what we can grab. It was me and somebody else in Walmart fighting over the last two. We didn't fight, we shared the last two dehumidifiers because I wanted to at least bring up another dehumidifier, small one, to be able to use in a conservation area. I stopped at Coca-Cola and picked up what we call shells. They're the plastic trays that Cokes all come in. I picked up 50 of them. They thought that I was nuts when I asked for 50 shells, and they kept asking me why the drinks weren't going to fit in my car for 50 shells. And I kept saying, no, I don't want the drinks. I just want the shells. I need the plastic trays that will drain as we pick up records, drain off the water as we move them into another area. And the reason why I stopped at Coca-Cola, a little tidbit, is because during Katrina, I was using Pepsi trays. And the archivist, see, you got to have your network. So I knew the global archivist and at Coca-Cola in Atlanta. And he told me, Lee, I don't ever want to see your slides when you're training again that have Pepsi on them, on those Pepsi trays. I will provide you with as many Coke trays as you need so that the next time you do a workshop, there's Coca-Cola splashed all over everywhere and not Pepsi. So he was true to his word. He called the New Orleans distributor here. And since then, when I call and I say, we have a disaster, I need to pick up some trays, they are there waiting for me as I pick them up. I tell that story because our network, and that's what this group is here, is important. Hurricane Ida was another horrendous situation for the Archdiocese. And I know that some of those people are here, both the director and the processing archivist. And what they went through a second time after Katrina, the lessons learned on Katrina was great, but every situation is different. And you have to get creative because it could be your satellite offices or it could be your building. And that's what happened this time during Hurricane Ida. A couple of the lessons I'll share in this, and then I will, when it comes out, I think I'll make sure, Aaron, you have this, but Kimberly Johnson, who's now the director, has written a great case study article that is going to be published in ARMA magazine about what she had to do and how she had to work through insurance, people at the building, hierarchy, getting mitigation in, who she talked to, what she did. And it's a great study. So shout out to her because I know she's here, but that will help with it. But a couple of things that are on point for this. We all have electronic keys to get in a building, right? We all swipe to get in. They don't work during a disaster. And if the person with the keys has evacuated, but somebody else has stayed back in the city, they can't get in the building unless for 3 days, which happened in this situation, for 3 days, the keypad was still on backup and still was able to get in. But after that, if you didn't have a key, you couldn't get in the building. So whoever is staying in the city should at least have a key. And that's part of that plan. People are evacuating. You need to know who's evacuating. Who has children that can't come back into the city right away? So there are some things that you can do now and have that at your fingertips. Making sure you have everybody's number and where they're going is important. So that's where I come from in this. So the next thing I'm going to go over is about 10 things that you can do now. What can you do in the next 3 months? The plans are great. You can have a manual that is this big, but that takes years in a way of practice and dedication and workshops within your organization of who's doing what. We have 3 months right now to prepare. We are on the heels of Ida. Many people still don't have, their roofs fixed. So we could blow again another roof. We could have windows that still aren't fixed. And I do know that's happened in some buildings. So again, what can we do now? So here's the list of what we can do now. And thank you to Jolie yesterday, who took some notes for me on what I mentioned, so I don't want to miss anything that I mentioned yesterday. Meet with your staff now. Find out what supplies you have and what supplies you need. So do you need plastic crates? Go behind your grocery store. If they have them out, ask if you can have them. I don't say pilfer them, but because they are getting picked up. But you can get some of those milk crates that we all know about, those plastic ones, so that you can have them with you in a supply closet. That helps drain off the water as you're picking up wet. Have paper towel end rolls of from newspaper. The newspaper on print newspaper, local print newspapers can't use the end roll. So it's unused, it's unprinted, and they will donate an end roll to be able so that you can cut it up for interleaving. It's not the most absorbent, but it works. You do have to continue to change out the paper as you're interleaving things. A rolling garbage bin with your supplies in it. Move it to the doorway. Make sure that your flashlights are on top, because you don't want to be able to get it in. You don't want to have to dig for a flashlight when you can't see. I have what I use. This is for crafting actually, but this is headlamps so that I can come in. I'm going to blind everybody, but it's able to, I can see and I can work and I can adjust these. These are actually for, as I said, crafters, knitters, sitting at night watching TV, and you don't want to disturb everybody else with the lights on. So I grab some things from home when I go into situations so that I have them. Batteries, gloves, buckets, trash bags. These are the items you need to have. You need to check with your maintenance staff to see what large supply items they have. Do they have enough large mops and buckets and brooms, and again, more garbage bins and garbage bags, so that you can move things out? Do they have a crowbar? I never thought I'd need a crowbar in a disaster area, but when a file cabinet doesn't open because everything is so swollen, I've actually had to have maintenance use a crowbar to break open file cabinets. One of my fun facts are puppy pads, or those absorbent pads that they use in hospital beds. Those are great for protecting things, and they also will wick away water. I don't have a whole lot of time, but there's a funny story about having to explain what a puppy pad is in French in the under-resourced countries of Africa, when they just don't understand why you just don't let the dog out. Why do we have to spend money to have these fancy puppy pads? If you have some left over from a puppy, put them in your disaster kit. They really are good. They're really great also for doing tabletop exercises. When a couple of years ago, the Archdiocese, there was somebody had sliced through a wall, and there was a time capsule, and they brought it to us. It's always Friday afternoon, and we were able to almost do a tabletop exercise of what could we salvage and what could we do with that material to make sure that whatever we could salvage, we salvage. So that was a great experience for us, and it was also a really good experience for staff to practice and put their knowledge to work. Put staff members in a team and identify the roles. That was already mentioned by Susan, but you do need to know who's doing what. And when you're preparing, who's moving things away from the windows, who's covering the items with plastic sheeting, what are you doing? And then what are you doing when you get back? So you have to remember to sort of convene a small meeting after the disaster to make adjustments to that existing plan, because that, the person in charge of something may not have been able to get back. What are your collection priorities, and how can you move them? Can you get them off site? There are many times you can't. And again, the latest situation in Ida was very eye-opening of when things could move and how they could move them at the Archdiocese. How can you protect those things that you are leaving in place? Where are your collection lists and finding aids? That will give you your priorities. And you need to make sure that they're either digitized or in an electronic format so that you can get to them. If you only have your finding aids in paper and that paper is wet, it has done you no good if it's still sitting in the facility. So you need to be able to have that as a backup. Certainly digitization of those critical items and the most valuable items. You don't want to lose them, but if you did, you would at least have them in a digital format. If you can take 10 items with you, what would those 10 items be? So right now you can sit at a staff meeting and say, if I had a full truck that we could evacuate out ahead of a storm, what would those items be? Are those items marked? You know, Susan talked about having a floor plan. Well, not only should you have a building floor plan, but you should mark within your stacks where those items are. And you can do that with glow-in-the-dark tape. And so they're fluorescent. So even with a flashlight, if you couldn't go in, but a first responder could, and grab a box, where is that box on the shelf? And you have to be able to articulate where it is on a floor plan, because they don't have a whole lot of time. So one large truck. If you only have a van and you can get 10 boxes, what would those 10 boxes be? What material would be in there? And if you can only take one item, what would the one item be? And if you ask your staff might tell you, everybody might have a different idea of what that item is. For the Archdiocese of New Orleans, to me, it was the 1727 drawing of the landing of the Ursulines in New Orleans that was done in charcoal, that was an original of the time of the period. To me, that had to get out, and that was one of the items that was evacuated. If I was at the Old Ursuline Convent Museum, the monstrance I know fits in my car. The portrait of Almonaster, which is a huge portrait, would not. So I have to make those adjustments as well. Know your insurance policy and the contact for those policies. If you're in a large institution and you're part of a university, you have to work through their insurance, and you have to work through that upper echelon. So you may have a small policy in place about what you're doing, but the larger institution is going to be dealing with a disaster all over a campus, and they too, you have to go through them. And so you have to know that. If you're a small museum, you're going to have your own insurance policy and have your contacts. So it really does depend on whether or not you're a huge facility, you're part of a larger organization, or whether you're just on your own and in more of an individual capacity. Evaluate your facility for simple mitigation now. Are your fire extinguishers up to code? Are there hazards in plain view? Or is there material on the floor? And you can, there's a Parbica, P-A-R-B-I-C-A toolkit. It's the Pacific branch of the International Council on Archives. And we're going to put this in the resources. But Parbica, the toolkit, is for records management. There are 24 different guideline principles. On 20 and 21 is disaster, and there are sheets that you can walk through your facility and fill out what is your building made of. Again, don't reinvent the wheel. Take the material that's already out there and use it to your advantage. Give a tour and meet and greet with not only your emergency responders, but also some of your fellow colleagues that are within your area. There's nothing like a new set of eyes that can walk through your building to know what it is. And if you have other professionals that are in your area sharing that, if you have 4 museums that are in one area, everybody plan some days to visit each other and see what each other has, so that You then can go and help them if it's a small disaster in their facility. Learn how to salvage wet and damaged items in place. So there's plenty. AIC has great videos. The Library of Congress has great videos. You can do that now. And you can do a practice tabletop of getting, you know, we all have junk mail and magazines and things that you can get wet, and you can practice what that would be, how heavy it is, how to drain it off, and how to interleave it. Lastly, understand your limitations, because we are all dealing with sometimes only 2 people in an organization, other times 100 people in an organization. So you want to make sure you know what you can do, and you want to be able to do that and do it basically as well as you can. I'm going to leave with this. Years ago, so as an archivist in Baton Rouge, after we were getting wet material, my colleague, who was at the time a young graduate student, we were getting wet records that were 4 months in a garbage bag from FEMA delivered to us, still wet, beginning to get some mold, having to get rid of the sludge that was on the cover. Knew that the information was important, not that because people needed their identity, knew that the information inside the book was critical, not necessarily the cover. We were peeling it off. We had learned, because we had spent the week waiting during Katrina to figure out what we needed to know, reading everything we could get our hands on, from the NEDCC, from NEH, because we had to educate ourselves. Now we have the education, but we had to educate ourselves. What are we doing? What do we need to be prepared for? Because this was a disaster beyond any, and we didn't necessarily know. We had the conservation people coming from LSU to help us set up a conservation lab. So Anne asked me, I said, you know, we keep trying to get this sludge off of this, and it's not doing it because we're rinsing it in tepid water like they tell us, you know, regular the water. I said, let's go with a little bit of warmer water. And she said, but what happens if it's a mistake and it damages the record? And I said, we're at a point that we have to try something different. So sometimes knowing all of those procedures then says, I've tried everything that is by the book. This is the theory, and I have to do something else creative because I have to try to save this information so we could digitize it and people could get their baptisms, which led to their identities, because Vital Records Office in Louisiana wasn't able to provide all of that right away. So education is key. Watch the videos, read what you can. 3 months, do a couple of proactive things now, and then decide how you're going to move forward in a year from now, having a larger plan. But there are plenty of things that you can do now. So I'm going to stop there because I know there's going to be lots of questions, and I'll give it back to Erin.
Thanks, Lee. And hopefully everybody's thinking of questions that they have for our panelists. I did mention in the chat, but I'll say it out loud. We know that sometimes talking about plans, whether you have them or you don't, what's happened in a response situation can be sticky. So if you have questions that you don't feel comfortable asking with your name attached, you can direct message me through the chat, and I will ask that question without your name or your institutional affiliation. That's great. Before we move to questions, I want to do a quick in the chat poll. So don't hit enter, but I want everybody to put in the chat, don't hit enter until I say so, your favorite disaster response supply, one item that you have in your disaster response kit that you find to be the most interesting, the most useful, the most creative. Think about it for a minute, put it in the chat, don't hit enter. We're all going to hit enter at the same time, but put it in the chat. Give everybody a little bit more time. All right. Are we ready? Okay, everybody hit enter. Anybody else? Okay, we've got garden gloves, blue shop rags. I like snakes just because I think it's funny that you use the I don't even know how to describe. They're like an anti-desiccant snake. A massive ball of twine, flashlights, multi-tool, Sharpies, headlamps. Great. All right. Now, we're going to go to the Q&A in just a second, but I want to kick it off with a question for all of the panelists, and that is, how do you make sure that the emergency plan you develop remains a living document that is utilized?
Should we just jump in here? Okay, I'll go first. I know that something that worked at my previous employer was to designate a couple days in either April or May to focusing on disaster preparedness. So I know that we would take a day to look at the plan, to update if any construction projects or capital projects had occurred over the past year, to make sure that that's referenced in the plan, to make sure everyone's contact information was updated. We'd do a brief phone tree exercise where we just practice calling the number we're supposed to call and checking in. And then we'd also have like an object handling training where we would train all of the frontline staff and security and facilities personnel to make sure that if something occurred on site during a time when collection staff wasn't there, that people felt comfortable moving furniture out of the way or getting to spaces that were going to have water or whatever on them. So just having like 1 or 2 days designated in the staff calendar, like set it and forget it every single year, where you're just you're forced to focus on disaster preparedness, was a really helpful way to keep it a cyclic measure.
And I think my example is similar. When I worked for a small museum, we did a focus on disaster planning and training and thinking about it and updating things each time we had our annual inspection from the local fire department. And that was just kind of a natural way to go ahead and use that as kind of a motivator to do a deeper dive each year. And like you said, it was something that we could set and forget because we knew they weren't going to forget to come around.
I found that after Katrina, people were more robust in planning meetings once a year, so that the disaster team, the people that were in charge, got together, updated whatever plan there was, or at least the information that was going out. Archdiocese of New Orleans was always making sure the sacramental records got out and that the Blessed Sacrament, Jesus had left the building so that he wasn't left to drown in a church. And so I think now, sometimes that depends on, and it's not in particular to the Archdiocese, but I do find it depends on staff, and it depends on the upper echelon of people that are at the helm, whether or not they think it's worth doing to have those key stakeholders have a meeting. And sometimes it's a matter of, just updating the manual that goes out once a year pre-hurricane season to make sure everybody's phone numbers is correct. And do you want to add anything else in here? And that's it. I find that if you're in a much larger organization, departments do better on individual planning rather than at a bigger level.
That's great. Thanks, guys. We have a couple of questions in the chat, and hopefully we'll get a couple more, but I will ask this one. We're all here because we're interested in preparing for disasters, but not all of us have the authority at our institutions to change policies and coordinate preparedness activities. Do you have suggestions for how to talk to the folks in charge diplomatically about how and why to get plans updated? That's a good one.
I would start small, if you build it, they will come. I might in-house without doing it at the plan level. I would do a tabletop exercise of getting lots of things wet within my small group. And then I would invite some of those other people to either stop by or to participate if they were willing, so that they could see that we were getting prepared, and that within our offices or within our department, we were being proactive to train ourselves what to do, to take the workshops, etc. So it's not necessarily a workaround, but it's that you got to start somewhere. So if you're starting internally, eventually that will grow out. You sometimes can't get the powers that be to put forth the money to mitigate. And it's after the fact that when you get blown away by another hurricane or a tornado or whatever, and they go, oh, well, maybe we should do that. And it's a reactive rather than a proactive. But I think that on a base level, we can all be doing something small and inviting them into our workshops and then saying, we're doing this in-house. We'd love for you to participate.
Thanks, Lee. Anybody else want to weigh in there?
I think that, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Susan. Go, Susan. You go first.
No, I think Lee's response was right on. And you can start with it in a small department or a small area of your institution and start creating your own internal responses. And unfortunately, sometimes people will not take action until they feel the pain of a situation that has caused some loss and some difficulties. Sometimes if that happens to somebody in your community, another agency or another cultural institution, sometimes you can learn that as, hey, we don't want that to happen to us. Look what they just had to deal with. I heard it cost this much money. And you could leverage, somebody else's situation to try to get people motivated. Sometimes that can work.
Yeah, I'll also just say, I remember that the dynamic and the importance surrounding planning kind of shifted after the collections department. I remember we had funding to bring in Rebecca Kennedy from Karai Collections Care to do a risk assessment for us. And during that process, we had some people from upper management involved. And in our plan at the time, we had names associated with each role. So with all the different, we adopted the incident command system and kind of put everybody into a role. And I remember she was like, well, what happens if this person is gone? Like, who's going to take over this role? And it kind of forced us to just like shake it up and to instead practice wearing different hats and putting ourselves into different roles by necessity. And unfortunately, I think it was like having the third party there really helped upper management see when, like, of course, staff had been making those claims over the years as well. But there's something about having an outside expert come in to just kind of like guide and share their own lessons learned that really helped at least our institution at the time. I don't know if that's helpful.
No, I think it's really helpful. And, from the LEH perspective, as someone who's trying to be a convener and to better understand what people need, sometimes until we have these conversations and Elena says something like we hired an outside consultant to do a risk assessment, some of us don't even know that that is a possibility. So I just want to encourage everybody to please take the LEH survey after this workshop and let us know what are the categories of funding, if we had them available, that would be most helpful to you in helping you better prepare. We have another question in the chat. Is there a state mandated or otherwise designated emergency temporary depository for collections, including three-dimensional items. We were very close to a need after Ida, and it was not clear if the state archives or anyone else provided that service.
Well, I don't want to, I know Catherine Newsom's on the line, so I don't know if she wants to weigh in as the state archivist, but I think she would be the best person to answer that. I probably could answer it, but I think we should revert to her.
I'm here. Can you hear me? Okay,
Yes.
great. Yeah, I was just replying in the chat, but I'll go ahead and let everyone know. I don't know of a mandate necessarily, but there is some guidance in revised statute 44:423 that if you are an agency of the state of Louisiana, you're required, if you are aware of an impending threat or damage to your records, to notify the state archives. And upon that notice, then that gives us the ability to assist. And so, yeah, obviously, please do contact us if you are in need of temporary storage. And we do have the capability to do that. And we're happy to help as we can. So feel free to give us a call.
And is that for
we had
state agencies only? Does that cover archives and museums that are not state agencies?
I think the mandate is for state agencies, but we're certainly willing to help anyone, nonprofits or anyone who is trying to salvage records for sure. You all know we don't have a huge staff here, but we definitely have willingness of people to volunteer and to assist. And a lot of times it's just even providing boxes so that you can rebox your wet documents, or if your boxes get wet. So we have the ability to assist for sure. We have an email address specifically for this. It's disasters with an S, disasters@sos.la.gov. And then obviously I'm happy to give my cell phone number, because a lot of times you won't have access to email if you're in a disaster, but that email address is monitored by the archives manager and myself all the time. And so that would come to our phones. But you can also text or call me. It's 225-937-4202 is my cell phone number. A lot of times, you're not at your work computer. So, but anyway, we're happy to help as we can.
Thanks, Catherine. Appreciate you allowing yourself to be put on the spot. Any other questions?
Sorry, I threw her under the bus. I didn't mean to throw you and say, here, you're at the meeting, here, respond. But I didn't want to put words in her mouth.
Any other questions from anyone, or any thoughts that any of our panelists have had as we've been listening to each other that they want to add? Okay, great. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us. I hope that you are able to attend next month's workshops. They're being held on May 17th and May 19th. They're both in the morning, Claire, is that right? They're both in the morning. And we will have a great lineup of experts. We've got Misty Taylor Pride from the Hilliard Art Museum, she's collections manager at the Hilliard. She'll be giving us a kind of case study of a disaster that happened at the Hilliard and how they responded. And it's not a storm related disaster. We're kind of right now in the Ida, Laura, Zeta, Delta post last 2 years mode, fixated on storms, but disasters can happen. A toilet can overflow. God forbid there's a fire, but fires can happen. There are all sorts of emergencies that are not weather related, as we've seen particularly with the COVID-19 outbreak. But we've got Misty Taylor Pride, we've got Rebecca Elder, who's with Rebecca Elder Cultural Heritage Preservation and who's the coordinator for the National Heritage Responders. And we have Lori Foley from FEMA, who is coordinator for the Heritage Emergency National Task Force to the Smithsonian. So I hope you'll join us. I hope you take the survey, follow up with me or any of our panelists if you have questions. And as I mentioned, we will be preparing a resource packet that we'll send out to folks. We'll also send the link to today's video for anyone who's interested. And please stay in touch and keep your eyes on the LEH website for disaster mitigation opportunities. And if you're not already signed up for the LEH newsletter, you can do that on our website as well. But thank you all for joining us. Thank you to our panelists, the Louisiana Association of Museums for partnering with us, and the National Endowment for the Humanities for funding these workshops. Bye, everybody.